Okay, today's daf we're going to learn is Megillah Daf Kaf Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Judy Auerbach in loving memory of her father, Shlomo ben Dov Ber, on his 33rd yahrzeit. His enjoyment when learning Gemara always impressed me, and now, thanks to Adran and Rabbanit Michelle, I'm able to realize the same enjoyment in learning Gemara as he had. Thank you. Today's daf is sponsored by Deborah Lewis, dedicated to Janet Lechus. And also, unfortunately, our learning will be dedicated in memory of the two soldiers, two pilots who were killed last night, or early this morning. I didn't pay attention to the details. Okay, we are going to start our learning from Tanu Rabbanan toward the bottom of Kaf Bet Amud Bet. I want to just start with a quick review because we got only to the end of the daf very late yesterday. So I want to do a quick review of the section before we got into this gufa. We had talked about Rav had come to Babel. He went to the Shul and he did two strange things. We're now dealing with the second one, which is he didn't bow down he didn't prostrate himself when doing tachanun. So the question is why? So we had three possible answers. I'll just summarize them. One was that he was on a stone floor, to which they asked, what about everyone else? Why was no one else on the stone floor? And then they said, well, maybe he was in a different area of the room. Why didn't he go near everybody to do it? That's because he didn't want to make everybody get up, and tachanun, bowing down while saying tachanun is only a minhag custom, so he didn't think it was important enough to bother everybody to stand up in respect for him. Number two, which is also just interesting to learn about, when you're an important person, you have to think about not putting other people in an uncomfortable or in an annoying position where they're about to be prostrating themselves in front of God, and then they all of a sudden have to come and show you respect. Also, it's almost like a slap in the face for God, because they're bowing down to God, and then they have to all of a sudden start showing respect to you. Number two, we said maybe he did it in a different way than they did. And we'll talk about this now, this idea about the words are, sorry, I'm just looking for them. He would pishut yadayim v'raglayim. Okay, really, you think about a yoga class. What he did was he would lie himself entirely on the floor. Pishut yadayim v'raglayim means you basically spread your arms and your legs, and you're basically lying on the floor, okay, like that. That's how he would do it. And you could then say that it was according to Ula's position, that's the only problem. Prostrating yourself on the floor is only a problem if you do it in that form. If you do it in some other way, it's okay. So everyone else was doing it in a different manner, and therefore it was okay that they did it on the floor. But meaning they all had stone floor, but he did it in a different way. And then they said, well, why didn't he just change and do it like they did on that one day? We don't change your custom. Another interesting, right? Each one kind of teaches you something very interesting, that if you're doing a custom different from everyone else, even if it prevents you from doing your own custom the way you want to do it, you still stick with your custom. This, by the way, goes a little bit against the whole idea of right, exactly what you're writing in the chat about makam shanagu. Aren't you supposed to do what everyone else is doing? So it's a good question. The third answer is he was an adam chashuv. He was an important person. Because of that, an important person isn't allowed to be falling on his face. Everyone else can, but not an important person, because unless you know you're for sure going to get answered, like Yoshua ben Nun. By the way, there's two ways of understanding this Yoshua ben Nun. Yoshua ben Nun was told, why are you falling on your face? Which either is understood to mean, oh, look, Yoshua was falling on his face. He was allowed to, but unless you're like Yoshua that you're going to be answered, you can't. Some people explain the exact opposite. He was told, Lama tanofel panav panecha, you're not supposed to do this. And therefore, we learned other people aren't supposed to do this as well. So there's a bit of a debate about how to understand the Yoshua story itself, whether it was okay he did it or wasn't okay he did it. Okay. With that, we'll get started with our daf. So finishing up yesterday's. Tanu Rabbanan, it says in a Braita. We're now going to talk about different ways of prostrating yourself. There's different words used in the Tanakh, and they mean different types of things. So kida, the word kida is al apayim, is on your face. Now, the way they understand this is, this really sounds like a yoga pose. We talked about this in the past. You put your thumbs on the floor, according to many of it's not exactly clear what it is, and you put your head on the floor. Okay, that's what they say, al apayim, on your face, but on nothing else, like a handstand, basically. Put your head down on the floor, and then the rest of your body goes up. Okay, so it really sounds like a handstand or something like that, where nothing else is on the floor. And how do we know that it's on your face? Vatikod batsheva apayim artza. It says tikod, that's from kida, and apayim on the ground, right, on her face on the ground, aretz. Kriya al birkayim, bowing, the word kriya, which is usually known to be bowing, is on your knees. Chenu omer mikra al birkav, from bowing on your knees. This is, I think, the way we normally think about a prostration, probably the way we go down on Yom Kippur, those who go down on the floor and bow. You go down on your knees, you put your head on the floor. That's mikra, right? Because it says mikra al birkav. That means you're using your knees, whereas in the kidah, you're not using your knees. Lishtachavaya, zo pishut yadayim v'raglayim. This, when we say lishtachavot, that's what we talked about Rav doing before, spreading out your whole body. Shneemal, havon avo ani v'imcha v'achecha lishtachavot lecha arza. Okay, it's not exactly clear from here, but because it says lishtachavot arza, the assumption is you're lying on the ground. Levi achve kida kamei de Rebbe v'itla. Levi showed Rebbe how to do a kida, and he became lame from it. Okay, he was limping after that. So they say, wait a minute. Right. So first of all, they're trying to show how dangerous it is to try to do this, because look what happened to him, right? He got into an accident trying to do this. So now the Gemara asks, V'haka garmale, that's what caused him to be limping? No, there's a different reason he got this injury. You should never speak to God in an arrogant kind of manner. Because look, there was a great person who did this, and he became lame. Umanu, and who is this? Levi. If you remember from Masechet Ta'anit, he said he tried to bring rain. The rain didn't come. He said, "God, alita lemarom ve'ena temashkiach habanecha." Rashi quotes it from there. In case you didn't remember, you can look there. He says, "God, what did you go up to the heavens and leave us here by ourselves? What, you ignoring us?" And the rain came, but Levi got punished for saying such a thing. So the Gemara answers, has they answered the same question in Ta'anit? Havaha garmale. They both caused this problem, okay? And if you remember in Ta'anit, if you learned Ta'anit, we discussed that it's similar to, let's say, the famous Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan story where they're standing near the wall, and that's when they're worried the wall's going to fall, right? That's when the angels are coming and want to make the wall fall on them. And there were other stories like that as well, that when you put yourself in a place of danger, that's when the punishment comes. Okay, punishment can't always get to you. Okay, you might be deserving of punishment, but you can't get there unless you put yourself in a dangerous situation, and then it's easy for the punishment to get you. So it was a combination of factors. Now getting back to this Tachanun issue, he saw Rav and Abaye that they did, okay, it's not exactly clear what this means. Matzle atzluye, Rashi says, al tzidehem v'lo noflim al pneihem mamash. Okay, and it probably sounds something similar to what we do at Tachanun. We don't fall on the floor, right? We put our hands, we rest our head on our hand, bend down like this, right? We bend down. That's more likely that that's what they did. What's interesting is they did it because they were an important person, and important people can't go down on the floor. Theoretically, the rest of us can, but I guess at a certain point, I didn't check the historical development of it, but we will talk about historical developments of other things today, but not on this topic. But anyway, it seems like, I'm guessing from there came our custom that that's what we do. B'Yom Tov Chamisha, we're now going back to the Mishnah, which detailed how many aliyot for each day. So we're up to Yom Tov. B'Yom Tov Chamisha, and I see your question, do women say Tachanun? Yes, women do say Tachanun. Whether they're obligated, I don't remember, but they definitely can and do. So yes. B'Yom Tov Chamisha, B'Yom Kippurim Shisha. Just to explain, for those who don't really know what Tachanun is, it's something that we say after Shemona Esrei, after the Amidah, both in Shacharit and in Mincha. There's a longer version on Mondays and Thursdays in the morning when we read from the Torah. And it's basically a prayer. It's a very beautiful prayer. It's a prayer that's basically saying you're beseeching God. You're almost at your wit's end. And part of the reason it comes right after Shemona Esrei is I've done my prayer, and now it's sort of up to God, right? One of the things you say, first of all, you bow down, then you sit, and then you stand up. And when you stand up with the words of Anachu lo neda ma na'aseh, ki halacha einenu. In other words, it's this way of saying, we don't even know anymore what to do. Like, I've tried everything. I've tried sitting, I've tried standing, I've tried bowing, right? And it's up to you, God. It's this idea that we're not in control of our lives, really, that God is orchestrating things, and we do our best, we do what we can, and then it's kind of left in the hands of God. So if you've never said it, it's a very interesting prayer. And there's all sorts of other elements that we're not in a tefillah class, so I'm not going to get into it, but since you asked. Yom Tov Chamisha, B'Yom Kippurim Shisha, and then we had on Shabbat Shiv'ah. Okay, and this is what we know to be, and we think this is totally obvious, but we're going to now see. There's a big debate about this. Okay, so we learned two things in the Mishnah about this. The first was, okay, so Yom Tov, you do 5 aliyot, Yom Kippur 6, Shabbat 7. Then we said, you can't do any less, but you can do more. Okay. And then we said, well, can do more is really only on Shabbat, not on any other day. So now they're going to say there's a bit of a problem with this Mishnah. Matnitim mani. Who does our Mishnah go like? Lo Rabbi Yishmael, lo Rabbi Akiva. It doesn't seem to match. Not Rabbi Akiva's opinion, not Rabbi Yishmael's opinion. Titanya, as we're going to see in a Braita, they both have a machloket about this, and neither one matches our Mishnah. So then we're going to be a little bit stuck. Yom Tov Chamisha, here's the Braita. First, we're going to see Rabbi Yishmael. Yom Tov Chamisha, Yom Kippurim Shisha, Shabbat Shiv'ah. So far, that matches up. Ein pochatim mehen ve'ein mosifin alehem. But you cannot add to them either. No fewer, no more. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. So that doesn't match our Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva Omer, b'Yom Tov Chamisha, b'Yom Kippurim Shiv'ah, u'b'Shabbat Shisha. You have to wonder why he has this order. I'm guessing he's just responding according to Rabbi Yishmael's order, but he basically says Yom Kippur has 7 and Shabbat only has 6. So that clearly doesn't match our Mishnah. The next line does. Ein pochatim mehen aval mosifin aleh. You can't take away anymore, but you can add. So mani, Rabbi Yishmael kasha tosefet, Rabbi Akiva kasha shisha v'shiva, right? Each one has a problem. Rabbi Akiva, it's either that you can't add, and right, our Mishnah says you can, or Rabbi Akiva, he has the flip about Yom Kippur and Shabbat. Amar Rava, Tana debei Rabbi Yishmael. It must be not Rabbi Yishmael, not Rabbi Akiva, but a Tana, a different Braita that we see from the house of Rabbi Yishmael. The Tana debei Rabbi Yishmael. There was a Tana who brought from the house of Rabbi Yishmael this Braita. B'Yom Tov Chamisha, b'Yom Kippurim Shisha, b'Shabbat Shiv'ah, pochatim mehen aval mosifin alehem divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Here in this Braita, it says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael exactly what it says in our Mishnah word for word. So that must be our Mishnah. To which the Gemara says the obvious question. But now we have a problem. Kasha de Rabbi Yishmael de Rabbi Yishmael. We have one source saying Rabbi Yishmael says you cannot add. We have a different source that says Rabbi Yishmael says you can add. So what's right here? Or how could we possibly have contradictory Braitot in the name of the same person? To which the Gemara says, Trei Tanai Aliba de Rabbi Yishmael. There are two different Tanaitic opinions about what Rabbi Yishmael said. Okay, and that we see very often, that it wasn't clear what he said. It could be, by the way, you could think about why there might be lack of clarity. If it's really true, the way we learned it before, that Yesh Mosifin, you can add, is only Shabbat, but not Yom Kippur and Yom Tov, then you could see why it might have gotten confusing, because some of them you can add and some of them you can't add. And maybe because of that, there was a little bit of confusion about what exactly he says, because it's a little bit strange, that line. It seems to be relating to all of them, but in the end, it's not really. So maybe that caused the confusion. Anyway, Mantana Lahadetanya. Now we're going to bring a different source, a very interesting source. And here I will discuss a little bit about the development of how this happened, although I accidentally closed my book. Hopefully I'll find where it is. I found it. Okay. We're going to now see Braita about what time Shul should start on different days of the year. Very fascinating. Halacha. Okay. Normally, most shuls start the same time no matter what. Sometimes you might start a little earlier on Rosh Hashanah because the davening's a little longer, or Yom Kippur. You might start later on Yom Kippur because you're not rushing home anywhere. So, right. But generally, often shuls generally have about the same time. Certainly Shabbat and Yom Tov are usually the same time. Again, sometimes minor variations. Anyway, let's see what it says here about this. Mantana lahadetanya. Who's the one? So now they want to connect this debate about 7 aliyot on Shabbat or the 7 on Yom Kippur. Okay, which by the way, right, you could see why there might be 7 on Yom Kippur, because even though we talked about before, there's karet on or maybe we didn't say that right. There's karet on Yom Kippur, but on Shabbat, there's Skila, which is more severe. We saw that yesterday. But there's also the issue that Yom Kippur is always viewed as the most sanctified day of the year, right? We don't eat. We're in a kind of a place like the angels. You could see why one might think the sanctity is greater than Shabbat, and that's why it should have 7 aliyot. So now the question is, we're going to have this Braita, and is this connected to this debate or not? Is it connected to the aliyot or is it not connected to the aliyot? So let's see. B'Yom Tov, ma'achrin lavo u'maharin latzeh. Yom Tov, we start Shul late and end Shul early. Okay? Shabbat should always be shorter on Yom Tov. Okay, tell me if you do this in your Shul. But it should start late, end early. Why? Okay, this is very interesting, especially historically. It's because people have to cook on Yantif, and because of that, they need more time. Now, you might say, wait a minute. the women were going to shul also. Aren't the women's the one that cooking? And they're going to determine the time for shul based on when women show up in shul, right? If you did that in most shuls, you would start shul much later because often the women get there later. First of all, the ones who are younger, have younger kids, it's harder to get out the door with all of them. Ones who have kids who are high school age, it's almost impossible to get them out the door. And you might be struggling for a while trying to get them out the door if that's your approach. But in any case, what seems to be clear here, and I see you're laughing about it in the chat, but it seems clear that the men were involved in the cooking as well, because they must have had some part in the cooking, because otherwise you wouldn't be making shul later on behalf of the women likely. So it seems that you would be ma'achrin lavo. By the way, you have to also remember, on the holidays, it could be that the women came more likely to shul. It definitely happens here. I know that women more show up to shul on holidays than on a regular Shabbat. So you make it late. And Memaharin, let's say you want to get out early because you have to fulfill the mitzvah of Simchat Yom Tov. Remember, we had the whole thing about Chetzio Lachem, Chetzio Lashem, right? The day is partly for God, but also partly for you. So we need to get out of shul. B'Yom Kippurim, where obviously we have none of these issues because we're not eating and we certainly can't prepare food. Memaharin lavo, machin, let's say you get there early, right? We always want to get to shul early because if there's no other reason, because you want to, first of all, people like to daven with sunrise, and you want to make sure to get Berachot Kriyat Shema in time and all that, and Kriyat Shema. So, right, that because the time for Shema is earlier than the time for davening. It's 3 hours into the day rather than 4 hours into the day, as we saw in the beginning of Masechet Brachot. And Ma'achrin Latzeit, and you go out late because nobody's rushing anywhere to eat any meal. B'Shabbat Memaharin Lavo Memaharin Latzeit. Okay, Shabbat is a little different than both. You get there early because you're not preparing any food really. Right? Maybe nowadays you have to take maybe something out of the fridge, freezer, something like that, but you don't really have that much prep to do. And Memaharin, let's say, but you do want to get out early so that you can get somewhere. Okay. So anyway, it's very interesting to think about. And I think of this story. Someone told me they were at a shul that always ended at 12 no matter what. And they're sitting in shul and they're seeing that it's going on. And the rabbi's speaking, they haven't even davened Musaf yet. And it's almost 12 o'clock. And then he says, I guess today they're not, right? He was a guest. And the person who brought him said, this shul ends at 12 no matter what. And he says, obviously they're not going to end at 12. And then basically the rabbi got up and said, well, we're going to skip Musaf today because we're ending at 12, and that's the idea here that, right? Obviously the idea is, well, get Musaf in and maybe the rabbi should have spoken shorter so they would have time for Musaf. Anyway, it's a bit of a strange story, but the point is that that here there seems to be this issue of make sure that you're done by a certain time. Okay, don't make people stay so long in shul because there's other things to do besides just sitting in shul. So, Lema Rabbi Akiva di'ile gavra yetera. Maybe this is Rabbi Akiva's opinion that Yom Kippur is the longest davening because it has that extra aliyah. Now you might say, wait a minute, extra aliyah, that's not going to add on so much more. One aliyah doesn't make the biggest difference. So the Gemara says, afilu tema Rabbi Yishmael. This doesn't necessarily go like Rabbi Akiva. It doesn't have to do with the aliyot really. To nefesh sidura de Yoma, it's because there's seder Yom Kippurim. Remember we learned in Yom Kippur and Yoma. All that has to be said and described, and it's got a much longer prayer service. It doesn't have to do with the aliyot. So in the end, we can't necessarily associate that braita with Rabbi Akiva. But before we move on, I wanted to, because as I started by saying, most shuls do not keep by this halacha, and it seems like it's pretty much halacha. And in fact, I will read to you from Hilchot Yom Tov in the Shulchan Aruch. Now, the Shulchan Aruch is written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, but there's notes of the Rama, Rabbi Moshe Israelish. Yosef Karo was more Sephardi, and Moshe Israelish was Ashkenazi, not so important for our purposes, but the Rama adds in his own notes that become part of the Shulchan Aruch, right? Printed edition has his notes in it. And he says, he quotes this halacha, the Shulchan Aruch did not, Rabbi Yosef Karo did not, but he says, Ubiyom tov ma'achrin lavo lebeit hakneset umemaharim latzeit mishum simchat yom tov. He quotes it la halacha. So again, we don't really see this happening. The Mishnah Berurah comments and says, and this is very interesting in terms of how things develop. V'ha'idna shema'arichim b'piyutim u'b'nigunim ben yotzer or l'kriyat shema. You might know this on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah davening. There's a lot of elements that aren't in most davenings otherwise, which are all these extra piyutim that we say usually in Chazarat HaShatz, right? When we repeat the Shemona Esrei. But in some kehilot, they still do this, where they added also extra piyutim. Some sidurim actually have it and show it like darkened, that, it used to be here. We don't do it anymore. They added all these extra prayers before Shema. Okay. So, and I've been in shuls where they say it. I've told the story before, so I'm not going to tell it again, how I went to daven early once, and then they started doing this. And then I said, I'm never going to finish before my husband has to go to shul. And when my kids were little, and I basically got stuck and couldn't daven in the end with the minyan because they did these extra things, which really shows you the problematic nature of them, that, it gets in the way. You always have to balance. And that's what happened here. At a certain period, they added all these extra prayers. And what happened? Because they added all those prayers, they basically had to cut out this halacha. Because if you add in all these prayers before Shema, then by the time you actually get to Shema, if you start late, it's going to be past the allotted time for Kriyat Shema. So because of that, they basically got rid of this halacha, is what he says. Because he says, the karov levadai, it's most likely she'avor zman Kriyat Shema. And therefore, tzarich lashkim b'chol yom v'yom k'dei l'krot Kriyat Shema b'zman ha'ra'ui. And therefore, every day you have to go to shul early. You can't make davening late because of all these added piyutim. Now, what's the most interesting part about this? If really we say, and again, I didn't research this extensively to see all the different opinions, but if we say that the whole thing changed based on what the Mishnah Berurah says, which is because they added all these extra piyutim, you would never get to Zman Kriyat Shema if we made davening late, then you could say, well, once they got rid of those piyutim, in most shuls, they don't say these before, especially on Yantif. Maybe if Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur someone does, but nobody really does it on a regular Yantif, then it should go revert back to the way it was, and we can start shul later. Right. Obviously, as long as you can make Zman Kriyat Shema, and that also depends where you live and what time Kriyat Shema is in the place that you live and what time of year it comes out. But the main idea is that theoretically we should go back to this halacha, but we don't, because that's kind of the way halacha evolves. It changed because of some situation that no longer exists, but it just became that was the norm, and it continued to be the norm. Okay. Anyway, that's just a small aside. Getting back to our Gemara. This is a bit of a strange question, because we have actually 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, right? Aliyot for different days. They're asking about the 3, 5, and 7. Okay. So 3, 5, and 7, what are they compared to? Okay. The days you say 3, the days you say 5, the days you say 7. I'm not going to go into which all those are. You know them by now already. There's a whole debate about who the machloket between. Either Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmani and someone who's with him. Who's that? Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi. Or some people say it the same thing, but in a different way. It's Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi v'chad and a guy that was with him, and Mani, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmani, who was the first guy. It's either him and someone who's with him, and then we add that, or him and someone's with him, and then we add that, right? But it ends up the same two people. Or some people say, Amrela, the one who was with Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi wasn't Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmani, it was Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani. You can see why people are confused. They were maybe brothers. They certainly had a very similar name. They're both the son of Nachmani. So let's get to the machloket. Chad amal keneged berkat kohanim. The blessings of the kohanim, if you notice, the first verse has 3 words in it. The second has 5. The third has 7. So that's how we get the 3, 5, and 7. Now you see why they're asking about the 3, 5, and 7. Again, it's a little strange because why they skip 4 and 6, but they want to see this 3, 5, and 7 is keneged that. The chad amal keneged shlosha shomrei asaf, 5 ro'ei pnei hamelech, and 7 ro'ei pnei hamelech. Okay, there's different places. The first 2 are mentioned at the end of Sefer Melachim in the destruction, when the Babylonians come and destroy the temple. There were people there that they take, right, that they exile. There were the 3 Shomrei Asaf and the 5 ro'ei pnei hamelech. These are people who worked in the temple. Then there's the 7 ro'ei pnei hamelech. Where does that come from? So if you remember in the Megillah, there's the 7 people who serve the king. And that's what Rashi says. Tosafos says, what are you talking about? We're going to learn this halacha from people that served Achashverosh? No way. Okay, so if you're happy with the Megillah connection, I see in the chat, no. Rashi says this definitely does not connect to Achashverosh. And they say, well, where does it say 7 ro'ei pnei hamelech? They find a source in Yirmiyahu, at the end of Yirmiyahu, also where it discusses the destruction. Also, it says there, 7 ro'ei pnei hamelech. So from there, we got the 7. And Tane Rav Yosef brings a braita to say, Shlosha chamisha b'shiv'ah. Shlosha, by the way, this is the difference between the 2 opinions. One is relating to the content of the blessing, and one is relating to people, which makes sense. Like we're talking about aliyot, how many people go up to the Torah, whereas the other is relating to, kind of what's said and how many times do we say it, let's say. So, or in how many different ways do we say it? 3 psukim, 5 psukim, 7 psukim, it shows, right, the Torah is said in many different manners, just like Berkat Kohanim. So now Rav Yosef brings a braita to support the second reading. שלושה, חמישה ושבעה, שלושה שומרי הסף, חמישה רואה פני המלך, and שבעה רואה פני המלך. So Amarle Abaye's reaction to Rav Yosef bringing this braita is great reaction, says, my time lamar. Why haven't you told me this? All this time I've been studying with you, you've never told me this. I can't believe you never told me this. Amarle, right? This sounds to me like something goes on in my house, right? Where someone will say, how could you never have told me that, right? There's certain things you just assume people intuit, right? Like your kids learn from you, they watch what you do. I don't know, you don't, like you never go, right? Your kids, as they gradually get older, you don't think, oh, well, maybe I should explain to them this at this point. You know, it's a problem because probably you should at some point, right? Whether it's halachic things or whether it's things about life or whatever it might be, right? We don't always think about, oh, what have I told my children? What have I not told them? And what do I think that they obviously are going to understand from what I do and what, you know, you also don't want to be lecturing all the time. So Abaye says to him, how could it be that you've never told me this? To which Rav Ashi responds, Amarle, lo havi adina dit tzricha to lay. I didn't know you needed to know this. Did you ever ask me something and I didn't tell you? And I wasn't withholding information or anything. Like, why are you upset with me? I just didn't know that you were interested in this, or I didn't know that you didn't know this. So that's why I didn't tell you. An interesting interaction, which again teaches us about teacher-student relationship or child-parent relationships and how we pass over information, and that we have to be conscious that they're not going to always assume everything. And sometimes you really have to give it some thought to what maybe would be important to pass down. Okay, next. Amar le Yaakov Mina'a le Rav Yehuda. So Yaakov Mina'a, it sounds like a strange name. It sounds like he's a heretic, but it doesn't really seem that way because he's not saying anything heretical at all. So some people say maybe he was a place called Min or something. It's unclear what his name means. But he says to Rav Yehuda, Hani Shishadi Yom Kippurim Kineged Mi. We talked about the 3, we talked about the 5 and the 7. What about the 6? Notice nobody asked about the 4. I don't know why, but he asks, where do we get the 6 from? Amar le, Rav Yehuda answers him, Kineged Shishasha Amdu Mimino Shel Ezra v'Shisham Mismolo. There were 6 people on the right of Ezra when he read from the Torah and 6 people on the left of him. So from there we learned 6 aliyot. Right? You might have said 12, but right, that's obviously too much. So we get 6. How do we know this? Shenema. Now you can start counting and make sure the count is right. Vayamod Ezra Sofer Migdal Eitz Asher Asu Ledavar. Vayamod Etzlo Matitya V'Shem Avaniya V'Uriya V'Chelkiah U'Masiya Al Yamino. That's 6. Next. Umismolo, Pedaya, Mishael, Malkiah, V'Chashum, V'Chashbadana, Zechariah, that's 6. But then it says Mishulam. Seems a little bit strange. Why does it say Mishulam? If, right, we said 6 on one side, 6 on the other. Now there's 7. Hani Shiva Ahavu, that's 7. So they say Hainu Zechariah, Hainu Mishulam. They're really one and the same person. By the way, a proof for this is it doesn't say En Mishulam. It should say end, right? Like it said, Mishael, Malkiah, V'Chashum, V'Chashbadana, Zechariah Mishulam. It actually should say and Zechariah also, and it doesn't. So it's a little bit strange, but either which way they say it's the same person. V'Maikar O Mishulam, Timishalem Be'uvdei. He was perfect in his ways. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we get to a very big sentence that the Gemara doesn't really deal with much at all. Daf Mishalahem this week goes in depth into this topic. I'll touch it a little bit on the surface. Tanu Rabbanan, right? Daf Mishalahem is a Hebrew content on our site. So if your Hebrew is good, you can listen. It's a video of Rabbanit Shiur Mervis and Chamital Shaval. Tanu Rabbanan. Hakol. So if you want to look for it, it's on our site on the Hebrew side, not on the English side. Hakol Olin Leminyan Shiva. Everybody can be one of the 7 people getting the Aliyah. Remember, Aliyah meant you got up, right? At a certain point, it meant you made the blessing before and after, and it means that you read from the Torah generally, okay? They would read from the Torah. So everyone can do this. Afilu katan, even a minor. You know, normally minors can't do these things, even a minor. It's, by the way, it's still practiced in Taimani communities, not generally in Ashkenazi communities, though there are some places where they let them in the last year before bar mitzvah. Ve'afilu isha, and even a woman. Wow, big statement, right? This is not done in traditional Orthodox communities, that women get aliyot, and you'll see why in a second. Aval amru chachamim, this is part of the same braita, okay? But the chachamim said, isha lo tikra b'torah mipnei kvod tzibur. A woman shouldn't read from the Torah because of respect to the community. Okay, so first of all, I want to point out one thing that many commentaries say that this afilu katan, afilu isha, okay, if we go back to the base halacha before we get to the fact that it was changed, is only to fill in, not to have, let's say, all 7 aliyot be women or all 7 aliyot be katan. Obviously, then, is it majority? Is it, it's unclear, but that it's only as a fill-in. Some people say no, it sounds like any. It doesn't mean, right? Olim the minyan shiva could be, any of the aliyot. So there's a question about how to understand that. And then it says that the rabbis changed this because it wasn't respectful for the community. Now, this is a big question. What does this mean? So most people assume that what this means is, in those days, remember we said recently that women didn't even know how to read. So if women didn't know how to read, and maybe women didn't even come to shul so much, why are you having a woman read from the Torah? The only possible reason could be because there's no men who know how to read, and this woman happens to know how to read. Now, that would be a huge embarrassment to the community, to have a community full of people where nobody can read from the Torah. So because of that, they said, if a woman reads, it's not respectful to the community, right? This isn't Kvod Torah, notice, it's Kvod Tzibur. It's not respect to the community. And that very much is seen in the context of the historical context. Now, why is this such a fascinating topic? Because this leads to the biggest question that pervades many things in Judaism today, which is the rabbis make this, right? They institute this change in halacha, which is women can't read, right? They can't get aliyot. For what reason? Because of Kvod Tzibur. If that reason is no longer applicable, can we say, okay, well, out the window with the takana of the chachamim, their reason's gone, it's not relevant, and therefore we can change it, versus other people who say, no, it doesn't work that way. Once the rabbis institute something, and we've seen this many times, right? Once they put in they change something, even if the reason isn't relevant, you can't just override it. Right. So this is the big debate within, right, whether it's between Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, whether it's within liberal Orthodoxy, there's partnership minyanim who basically hold based on this, right? And Rabbi Professor Farber is behind the partnership minyanim saying that halachically they're valid because of this and because the Kvod Tzibur is no longer a relevant issue. Right? Whereas other people say, no, this is the way we've been doing it for years, and we don't change things like this, and we don't change rabbinic gzerot just because they don't seem relevant anymore. Right? You could see where that would be a dangerous thing to do. Right? You could start changing lots of things. So this is the debate. I'm trying to give a very neutral approach to it because I think that there's room for all of the different opinions. That's wherever people are, those are there. That's where they hold. So this is a very, right, one line in the Gemara, basically, from a Braita that the Gemara doesn't even deal with, and yet it turns into a very big issue, right, and a dividing issue between different groups where they draw their lines on this issue. So this is a very, very important line. Okay, much more to be said on it, but we're going to move on. Question is asked, maftir, okay, they know that there's a concept of maftir. What is maftir? Maftir is that whoever is going to read, it was clear they read from the Torah, and then they read from the prophets. Whoever's going to read from the prophets also gets an aliyah Torah. The big question is it counted as one of the 7, or is it in addition to one of the 7? Which means in the end, there's really 8 aliyot. So Rav Huna and Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, they have a machloket about it. Chad amar ole, it's part of the 7. V'chad amar eino ole, and another one says it's not part of the 7. Manda amar ole dehakare. He's reading from the Torah, so of course it should count as one of the 7, right? He's doing no different than everyone else. Uman damar einola, the one who says no, says kedeula. He holds like ula damar ula mipnei ma maftir b'navi tzarich shikra b'torah tchila mipnei kvod Torah. So ula says, why is the maftir b'navi? Now here you're going to learn why there's maftir in shul. Okay, you already know the answer to this question if you've been in shul, which is maftir is in addition, right? And we actually repeat the last 3 verses. Not clear from here whether they repeated the last 3 verses or not. That's definitely unclear. You'll see, especially in another minute. It seems like maybe they didn't, but I don't know about that. But the main thing is we don't want someone getting up to read from the prophets who hasn't read from the Torah. It's almost like a slap in the face to the Torah. I don't want to read from the prophets, so I don't want to read from the Torah. I'm just going to read from the prophets. That's not respectful. So they add in that he's going to read from the Torah. And yes, that's why we say Kaddish in between, to make a separation between the Torah reading and the maftir. So we clearly hold like, right, Ula says, the way they understand according to Ula, that if Ula says it's all because of Kvod HaTorah, then, right, it's for some external reason. Because of respect for the Torah, that's why he gets an aliyah. It's not part of the 7. That's something additional. So now they say, Meitive. We're going to bring a question against that opinion. It says in the following bright, Hamaftir b'navi lo yifchot me-21 psukim. When you get up to read Haftorah, has to be minimum 21 verses. Okay, if you're thinking not necessarily always, you'll see your answer in a minute. But right now, let's just assume 21 verses. Kineged shiva shekahu b'torah. Why 21? Well, 21 divided by 7 is 3. Everyone reads minimum 3 psukim in the Torah. There's 7 aliyot, minimum 21. So therefore, minimum of the Nevi'im is 21 kineged, the 21 psukim that were read from the Torah. V'imita, but if we add an extra 8th oleh l'Torah and he reads 3 psukim, then esrim v'arba'a havyan, then it should be 24. This is why I said it's not clear if he read different psukim or the same psukim, because if he read the same, there was still only 21. It sounds almost here like maybe he reads 3 more psukim, but unclear. So they say, no, kevan de mishum kvoda torahu kenegdo nami lo bai, because the only reason to do this is because of respect for the Torah. You don't need to have 3 keneged. You don't need 3 more verses than the prophets for that. There's no point. So it doesn't really prove anything. Matkifla Rava says, "V'harei olotechem sfu." What about this Haftorah? So the Haftorah apparently for Parashat Tzav, which we, I think, never read because we always read Tzav. I think always is Shabbat Gadol, or maybe almost, no, it's not always Shabbat Gadol. But I think we normally read something else in Tzav because of that, but maybe we do read this sometimes. I don't know. You can look it up. But what about this one? It's not 21, but Karinan. And we read it, right? It's definitely not always because my daughter, that was the week anyway, she was on, I remember hers was Shabbat Gadol and it was not Parshat Tzav. So I'm not sure. But anyway, there is this, we could check whether this Haftorah really gets said, but anyway, it's not 21 and yet we read it. So the Gemara answers, Shanei hatam disalik inyana. This is different because the topic, there was closure in less than 21 psukim. The topic ended. You're not going to start reading on more. So wait, you're going to say it's always 21 though. If it hasn't finished the topic, then you for sure continue up to 21. Sometimes I would go before Rabbi Yochanan. After 10 psukim, we would read, he would tell us to stop. So how can you explain that? That's only 10 verses. That's a lot less than 21. So they say, if there's someone translating, that's different. Okay. If you remember, we talked about people, someone would read and someone would translate. Here again, you get back to the issue of what we call tircha de tzibur. We don't want to make people stay in shul for too long. So if someone's reading from the Haftorah and someone else is translating it at the same time, then after 10 verses, you can already stop. And Ditani Rav Tachli Farber Shmuel, as he says, Lo shanu ela b'makom she'ein turgaman. It's only where there's no translator do we say 21. But you could stop it less if there's a turgaman because you don't want to make people stay for too long. Mishnah. And porsin el shma. Okay, wasn't interesting enough the topics for today. Now we're getting to the issue of minyan. Okay, all the big women's issues. Okay, so now this Mishnah is going to say for the following things, you need 10 people. Now I say people, it doesn't specifically say the word men here. Now it could be, it's just obvious that they meant men because that's what they spoke in those days. But you need 10. And I will say that some of these things, there are some people who hold, depending on what the issue is, and I'm not, again, I'm not going to get into all the halachic ins and outs. It's possible that sometimes 10 women could count for a minyan for certain things. I'll give you an example. One of the things listed here is Birchat Chatanim, which is Sheva Brachot. There's different people who do claim that maybe under the chuppah, or maybe not under the chuppah, but maybe at the Sheva Brachot during the week, a woman could potentially say Sheva Brachot. There are ways, right? It hasn't become very common, but there are reasons to think that maybe the need there is not the same as the need in other places. Again, I don't know all the ins and outs about why. So I want to read up more about it. I've been meaning to for a long time, but anyway, there's a lot written about that. So again, this is going to all require 10. Generally, the assumption is we mean 10 men. Again, depending on, as we talked about before, where you draw your line, whether, going to all the different zramim, as we say, I'm trying to think of the word, but the different denominations, people understand these in different ways. Aim porsin al shma. Okay, this is a bit of a strange thing. Okay, these are all aim this, aim that, unless there's 10. Okay, so now, aim porsin al shma, it seems to be something about the blessings of Kriyat Shema, whether it's saying the blessings, whether it's the baruchu of Kriyat Shema, different possibilities among the commentaries what this means. Ein ovrim lifnei ateva. You don't get up to daven shliach tzibur, right? Unless you don't have chazarat hashat or a petition of Shemona Esrei, unless you have a minyan. Ein osim et kapehem. Birkat Quranim is only done with 10. Ein korim b'torah. Kriyat Torah is done with 10. Ein maftirim b'navi. Also in the prophets, you don't read the Haftarah unless you have 10. Ein osim ma'amad u'moshav. Okay, this is some custom they did with when they buried someone. They would carry the body, they would stop, sit down, then someone would give a eulogy, then they would stand up again, move, stop, sit down, and they would do this according to Rashi 7 times during like the procession to the grave. Ein omrim berkat avelim. This is a bracha of the avelim. Tanchumei avelim. This is the shura that they do, right? Where they make 2 rows. The avelim walk in between, and they say Makom Yinachem Etchem. At the cemetery, we do this. So you don't do that unless you have 10. Berchat chatanim is the Sheva brachot. Aim is amnim b'shem, zimun with God's name. Nevarech Elokeinu shachanu mishalo. Pachot me'asara. Okay, all these things require 10. Another 2 things that require 10, but with another more specific issue, specific requirement. Bikarkaot, when you evaluate, if you give your land to the temple, they have to evaluate what the value of the land is, and you don't give the land, you give the value of it. How do you evaluate it? Tish'a v'kohen, 9 people, and one of them, and in addition, the 10th one is a kohen. And Adam kayotze b'hem, the same thing if you have to evaluate a person for value for the temple. We'll get back to exactly what that is at the end. Minane mile. So where do we get all this from that you need 10? Famous Gemara about where we get minyan from. Amar Rav Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, da Amar Krav, v'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Israel. I will sanctify myself within the Jewish people. Kol davar shebikdusha lo yehei pachot me'asara. So nikdashti is anything of sanctity, has to happen within 10. Now, it didn't say 10 in that pasuk, so the Gemara is going to say, my mashma, where do you get from b'toch b'nei Israel that has to be 10? So, Detani Rabbi Chia, atya toch, gzera shava, the word toch appears here, and the word toch appears somewhere else. K'tiv hacha v'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Israel. That's our verse. Uktiv hatam hi badlu mitoch ha'edah. When it comes to Korach, says separate from the edah, from the people. Now, okay, so b'toch, we learned it from edah. How do we know edah is 10? Here we have it. Ate edah dechtiv hatam ab matai le'edah hara'ah hazot. It says by the meraglim, the spies, for how, right, ab matai, how long will they be this edah hara'ah hazot behaving this way? Now, who is bad? The 10 spies. There were 10 out of 12 that were bad. There was Kalev and Yoshua who were good. So edah, you see, is 10. Notice they learned this all from bad people, Korach and the edah, right? The edah of the people who went after Korach and the edah of the people who went, right, the spies. And Malahalan Asara, Afkan Asara. From there you get, so again, let's go backwards. Edah is 10. Bitoch edah comes up somewhere else, right, by Korach. That's how we learn from the spies to Korach, that edah is 10. From Bitoch, we learn Nikdash Bitoch Bnei Israel that you need 10. So why does this need 10, right? Some of the things they don't need to say because it's Devarim Shebikdusha, as we say, but what about the other ones? So Kevan Debai Lamemer Imdu Yikarim Amodu, Shvu Yikarim Shevu, they announce Yikarim, special, right? You special people sit, you special people stand. So Yikarim has to be a community of people, so they call that 10. But it's not appropriate to call a group of people that aren't Yikarim, thank you, dear ones, that's maybe a better translation, dear ones, if it's not a group of people. That's not the most convincing, but my berkat avelim, berkat rechava. Okay, they describe this is what the bracha is. It's called berkat rechava. So it's a bracha they used to say for the avelim. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, berkat avelim ba'asara ve'ein avelim min haminyan, berkat chatanim ba'asara ve'chatanim min haminyan. This is very interesting. When you count the minyan for berkat avelim, the avelim are not part of it, and I think that's because avelim generally feel detached from the community, whereas chatanim, it's the opposite. Right? They're part of the community, so they get counted in the 10. When you're counting the minyan for avelim, you need 10, not including the avelim, the mourners. Why is that? Again, we're saying, let us bless God. You don't bless God unless you have 10 people. So first we're going to start with the karkaot, and then we'll get to the kohen, with the person. In that whole section where it talks about evaluating land that someone sanctifies to the temple, the word kohen appears 10 times. So you might say that means only a kohen, and you would think 10 kohanim. But comes the Gemara and says, classic way of explaining the Torah, chad legufe, one is for its own sake, because you need to say it has to be done by a kohen. That's how we know we need one kohen. The idach, all the rest, having miyut achar miyut. This is a specification after a specification, right? It already specified only a kohen. Then it keeps specifying kohen, 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 kohen. So when you generally have a specification and another specification, we say they it's like a double negative, it becomes a positive. So here it becomes lirabot, to include something else. So what are we going to include? We're going to include this extra, the Kohen, the Yisrael. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm distracted because I was reading a question. I want to make sure that this is clear. It's not that Avelim don't count for a minyan. It's that Avelim don't count for the minyan for the Birkat Avelim. When they bless the Avel, they say this Birkat Avelim, then he's not included. Not that he's not included in a minyan in general. Not to be confused. Okay. That's not what we were talking about. Okay. Going back now. So therefore they get to Tisha Yisraelim b'chad Kohen. So the first Kohen says only a Kohen. After all that, all the subsequent mentions all come to include Yisraelim. So from there we get to 9 Yisraelim. To which the Gemara asks, if it really is it should be like this. Miut, right, Kohen, and then Lirabot Yisrael. Then the next one is already a Miut again, and then Lirabot, and then Miut, Lirabot. Every other one should be a Kohen, and the other extra should be including. So it should be 5 Yisraelim and 5 Kohanim. To which the Gemara answers Kasha. You're right, it's a good question. We don't have a good answer. But Adam kayotze. So Adam mi kadosh, a person can become sanctified. There's no such thing. This is when someone says, I'm giving the value of a person to the temple. Okay, it's not like you're saying I'm giving the person to the temple. We don't do that. But you can give the value of someone to the temple. There's 2 different ways to do it. One is what we're talking about, and the other is erchin. Erchin, if you do it in a particular way, erech ploni alai, then it has a particular value set in the Torah. It never changes. But if you say demei ploni alai, the value of the person, then it goes by the value of what they're worth in the shul, in the marketplace, if you sold them as a slave. So omer davar damei alai shamin oto ke'eved. You evaluate him like the price of what a slave will be worth in the slave market. The evet, and that you have to give to the temple, that amount. Now, how do we know you need 9 in a Kohen, 9 Yisraelim in a Kohen? Evet itzkash l'karkaot, because Evet appears in the same verse as land, and therefore whatever's true for Evet is true for land. And since land needs 9 in a Kohen, therefore this too. Here they're actually talking about slaves that are Canaanite slaves. They go like an inheritance to your sons. To inherit achuzah, which is always a term used by land. Okay, so therefore you see, slaves are like land, and therefore, if you say the value of a person, you have to evaluate them in the slave market. To evaluate what they're worth in the slave market is done by 10 people, 9 plus a Kohen. With that, well, then for today, we'll start the next Mishnah tomorrow. Gave you a lot of food for thought on all sorts of interesting topics today.